Anyway, welcome to our third Innovations and Insights session here, where we have been investigating philosophers and theorists and educators from previous eras. Today, we're going to talk about Neil Postman. I think for purposes of our discussion, the most important thing to know about Neil Postman was he was an incredible cultural and technology critic, media theorist, uh, very kind of just incredible mind, like big mind, and wrote a lot of books. But also really important to know that he passed in 2003, I think. And so when we're thinking about Neil Postman, we're thinking about today's context, and he was such an interesting critic of technology and media that it's important to think about the context of 2003. Like Facebook wasn't there yet. There was no Twitter. I think Flickr had just been founded. Most people used dial-ups. I mean, the internet and personal computer technology was just a very different time, even though to my mind, 2003 seems like yesterday in some ways, but it was a vastly different environment. So we are thinking a little bit about how some of these translate now. And I'm always thinking, as I was talking with Todd about the session before this, every time I look at anything by Postman, I just keep thinking, man, what would he make of things today? What would he think about what social media and social platforms have become, and AI and things like that? So I don't want to go deep into any biography about him, but I do want to check. And I see Lauren. Hi, Lauren. Welcome. I do
Hi,
want to
thank you.
check though with both Lauren and Jeremy. What do you know about Postman? What immediately comes to your mind, if anything, or is this brand new to you? Lauren?
Honestly, I just what caught my eye was amusing ourselves to death because I had read that book and I had no idea that he was associated with UW or anything. And yeah, I read that book several years ago, and uh, yeah, so that just caught my eye, and I like hearing about uh, ideas of his.
Right? Yep. No. And just to be
I
clear, he's
mentioned,
not affiliated with UW, as far as I
Oh,
know.
he's not? For
This
some
is
reason, for
we're
some reason, I thought that in what you sent that he was, but it makes sense that I didn't know that because it seems like I would have if he were. So that was just
well,
some confusion on my part.
that's
But
probably my phrasing. Maybe I was subtly trying to lure people in thinking something, but I unintentional. What was that, Todd?
I just was curious, what was the context that you picked up that book? What, just on the shelf because the cover's kind of interesting, or
no, in fact, I don't even know what the cover looks like. I think because I got it from the library and okay, there you go. Yeah, first time I've seen it. Sometimes when you get things from the library, they have been rebound or something. Um, so I didn't actually know what the cover was. No, it just several people who I listened to had mentioned the book kind of independently. I can't remember all the different ones. The only one that pops into my mind is Zach Galifianakis. Um, he mentioned it, and then I heard a couple other people mention it, and um, so I just added it to my reading list and read it, when it came up in the queue. So
Interesting. I had no idea Zach Galifianakis ever mentioned Neil Postman, so that's pretty awesome. How about you, Jeremy?
I wasn't familiar. I was just
All right.
drawn in by the description.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I did a good job of the description, I guess. Postman was amazing. I can't recommend highly enough, especially Amusing Ourselves to Death. My own favorite, Amusing Ourselves to Death and Technopoly. But Todd, tell us a little bit about Neil Postman and why he matters. Why does he matter now? I mean, the guy's passed 20 years ago.
yeah. So I mean, I have two daughters, 26, 21. We have all watched people on their phones for a while now, and whether it's any new media, TikTok, or all that sort of stuff, if you read Amusing Ourselves to Death or some of his other works, you will see exactly what he was talking about in our society. So I really feel connected to that, but that's not why I like Neil Postman at all. Here's how I bumped into Neil Postman. In 1983, I was in a class called Alternative Methods in Higher Education. I was at a small liberal arts school. And here are the two books that we used as textbooks.
Mhm.
So one was Neil Postman, Charles Weingartner, and the other was the rewritten version or updated version of a book called Freedom to Learn, which a therapist by the name of Carl Rogers wrote. And both of those books just definitely touched me. I mean, they were both about teaching. They were both written in 1969, which is also my favorite year for music. But, you know, they both spoke to me and my experiences at that point in my schooling career. I was effectively a junior. I'd been to community college for a couple of years, and then it was my first year at a small liberal arts school. And you can tell, and here's probably what it was, because I wish I could give really detailed descriptions of this, but I loved wood shop, silversmithing, pottery, stained glass in high school, but I hated school in general. And I did not like community college. When I got to this private liberal arts school and I was reading these books, I was like, aha, I'm not the only one that's suffering through this misery of schooling, you know? And if you look at, so there's an apple that's a bomb, right? And the word subversive. So the guy is definitely like selling rebellion. Here's another one of his books, The Soft Revolution. I mean, it's a revolution, you know, and it's like all hippie, peaceful sort of stuff, but with the pen. That's what grabbed me. And I still feel more attached to a sense of we need to improve, and I'm super passionate about or excited about improvement in our work as teachers, as schools, and I think that's what really spoke to me. Yeah, so that's what gets me going the most, is that we need really to improve what we're doing, because it's just been too long. It doesn't mean we have to demolish everything, but I think we are easily amused, and we will sit and passively consume the bureaucracy, the policy, the whatever that doesn't really create forward motion in the work we do. So people who know me would. I am also Year of the Dragon, so like, and I'm an Aries, and like, you know, I'm just yeah. Anyway, that's what it would be.
It's interesting with Postman because he was, of course, when he, you know, amusing ourselves to death about television and essentially how television is affecting culture, and the idea that, you know, from the telegraph to television, we saw this shift in the idea of information and what we wanted access to and when we wanted access to it and how we valued it or not. And we went from mostly localized, delayed time kind of access to information to, with the telegraph and then the television, kind of information everywhere. And it's funny to think about, he was already concerned about the excess of information. He had this, what did he call it? The information to attention ratio, I think he called it. And even then he's saying, like, we get all this information that we can't have any action on. It doesn't mean anything to us, but we get it and we feel that we want it and need it. And we start feeling left out if we don't have it. And so we have all of these inputs coming in from all over that we aren't necessarily acting on, but we feel this need to receive it. And what is that doing to our thinking and attention span? And it's amazing to think about that. This is all pre-real internet, like what we would think, all pre-web. So, you know, to me, it reminds me of those, you know, those researchers who in the 20s and 30s were already talking about the problems with corn syrup and sugar in our diet and processed foods, and trying to say, look, we need to think about our relationship and orientation to food and eating as we technologically change. And they were these voices in the wilderness, and you see what's happening now. And I see a similar kind of affliction in how we deal with technology, our approaches as institutions, as educators, and what we're preparing students for in the world that they're already in and maybe know more about than we do. And it's an ailing system. It's a sick system when it comes to attention and algorithmic driving of for motivation and interaction, which is usually attention. And we're not really thinking about it very much. We don't consider it that often. And especially if you're teaching hybrid or online courses, but really any modern university education, has a lot of technological influence, both around what students are doing, information they're receiving, and what they're creating. And I think Postman is just a reminder that those technologies are shaping what we're doing. And we don't often think about that. And, when I think about instructional design and course design, it's fascinating to me how many things just become commonplace and accepted, that we need to have these things. And they are usually evolutions of a technological drive from somewhere else, right? For some other reason. And we're integrating them in because it either seems natural or because we think we have to. But Postman keeps kind of asking at the time, why? And how are we doing this carefully? Why do we think we need to do these things? So I see it just as a great reminder, and he's just a really interesting writer, and he had some fascinating ideas. Like if you read The End of Education, he has this whole model, this like 5-step model for revamping and revising education. And I'll just give you a couple of titles of the sections. It's Spaceship Earth, which is, the idea that we are citizens of the globe. Fallen Angel, that we need to understand and overcome factor. I think they call it grit or something now, right? Resilience, whatever the buzzword might be around that. The word weavers and the world makers. Like, he thought big about this, but then dialed it down into what the media actually looked like. So for me, that's what Postman brings, is that get that antenna back on, thinking about why we're doing what we do. And in our classes, I think Lauren is here, and it's great because he's taking a course right now. I don't think that's private, right? You're taking this teaching course with us now. And what's coming up a lot, literally right now this week, is about discussion and how to have an engaging discussion. And what do you do to facilitate discussion in the classroom? And Jeremy, you probably experienced this with teaching online or hybrid courses or having discussion components, right? How do you get students engaged? And why is this discussion not working? And what do we do? And I think Postman would say, why are you having these discussions in the first place in a technologically mediated environment? Does that make the most sense to replicate what we're doing right here in an asynchronous bulletin board? He would, I would assume, say no, based on what he talks about with television. So we need to get back to, I think, the principles of why we're doing what we're doing and how we're bringing technology in, instead of having the deterministic aspects of technology drive how we're approaching our classes. That's what I get from Postman. So, I mean, how do you think about the technologies you're using in your class or thinking about using in your class as you're building out something new? I know Jeremy, before you got here, Jeremy was saying that he's going to be teaching soon again and considering what he wants to do. And Lauren, I know you're prepping and building online courses right now and thinking about these technologies. How are you approaching the thoughts of bringing technology in a critical way into courses and preparing your students for this environment?
So I'm just going to come right off of what you were just talking about, was the question of discussions, because I'm having we're doing this next gen civic engagement leadership core right now. We have a Canvas page set up for that. And the idea was to, given our campus community, have an online opportunity for discussion about these students' interests in government and community engagement. And it's a failure. Students have no interest in engaging in that discussion. And so my thought, because as you were saying that, was, well, we write a discussion, we do a discussion board because we're trying to recreate something, right? We are in a different type of school here at Tacoma, same with Bothell, right? Where students aren't just sleeping in their dorms over there. And so we're trying to recreate something that we remember from our own college experience online. And so as I'm listening to you kind of talking about doing things in the service of technology, which, we do lots of. In this case, it's using technology in the service of a model that just might not work here. But I think Canvas is the structure of Canvas is very much trying to allow us to attempt that recreation, if you will. Maybe I have that wrong.
No, that's
my-
absolutely right, I think. Yeah, I mean, the learning management system in general, that's one of the things I think about over the last 20 years is learning management systems have evolved and grown. They've taken for granted certain approaches, and discussion being one of them, and they all do that, right? They all provide that facility to have potentially that thing. And then therefore we see it and we're like, we need to have that thing. I mean, the number of times that someone will ask me as I'm working with them about, oh, how do I use this X thing in Canvas, right? Or how do I use this Y thing in Blackboard? And that's not the right question, because you should be coming to that only based on what you want to do, right? But it's like I mean, and I get seduced by this too. Like, oh, hey, there's this new thing that I can do. Oh, how can I use that? So it's, I think it's always going to be somewhat, there's going to be a feedback loop. But you're absolutely right. How many legions of communities and activities and programs and classes have discussion boards just like you're describing? Set it up so that we can have this discussion around X, and we don't see that happen, and why. And so, yeah, I mean, the questions of why are complicated. There are lots of different reasons, but I mean, in the end, it just makes me feel like you're saying maybe this is just the wrong way to try to replicate something that still works great in a face-to-face class. I mean, I'm all about discussion in synchronous situations, especially. But what am I trying to get? What do I expect to happen out of this discussion? And how can I lead my students or participants in different ways? And so in addition to different structures and types of discussion, you also have things like shared annotation and collaboration. Doing presentations together or whatever. There are a lot of things where you have another object in there that keeps people busy. And it's similar with Postman's thoughts like about television and the telegraph. They're not bad things. It's just our first thought shouldn't be, how do we get this on TV? It should be, why do we want this on TV in the first place? So yeah, I would be thinking, do we really need discussion at all? Is this not, can you not reach those ends in other ways? Nope.
One of the chapters in here is the inquiry method, and he's all about inquiry, like asking questions, right? I mean, he very much it wants that as part of any course. I would say that, I've been in classrooms with faculty prior to a class starting where, I mean, we weren't even talking to one another, and students were coming into the room, and it was a room that would say hold 38 people or something. And the students coming into the room, filter towards the back-ish or the outside edges. They usually sit and will soon maybe look at their phone. But it's not often that they start talking to one another. And weirdly, I mean, I watch this frequently. A lot of times the faculty member won't even engage them individually with a hello or anything as they walk into the room. I mean, that actually happens. They're busy emailing somebody at the podium, or something. But I think part of that problem is just the mass of people, the time, the amount of other things we all have going, the next meeting coming up or whatever. But I know, so going back to my undergraduate experience, I mean, I was in a class of like 10 people, and we always sat in a circle, and we always looked at each other in the eyes. And when you sat or came into that space, you were engaged right away by somebody, and you were talking about things. You couldn't sit, there literally was no back row to sit in. And while some people might prefer that, I mean, I think our discourse, the way we engage with our world and other people, has been influenced over the years by, 60 years of sitting in rows and looking at the backs of people's heads. I mean, that has been our experience for so long that we have learned perfectly how to not be able to talk to people. And it's just easier to look at TikTok on your phone and not ask questions, but just consume. And I think Postman would probably agree with some of that. But this is back where I do believe that at some point in time we can harness the academic spaces we have in our world to push for smaller classes that don't always sit in rows, that actually can be accomplished in our lifetime. Maybe not 10 people, but maybe 15 rather than 37. I mean, if we fund this operation well enough, we could do that right now.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a real challenge with Postman to me, is that so much of what he talks about feels like it needs to be addressed at a much higher and larger level. Like, what can I do here when the institutions, like, yes, having much smaller classes would be great. Having, authentic alternative grading systems would be awesome. Having, community moving through time over an institution would be great. But the reality is, most of the time we end up having to go into the room that might have bolted down tables and might be in rows and might have 60 people. And so, I'm always challenged by that. And we see these common threads. We've had discussions about Carl Hahn, about Kurt Hahn, about Carl Rogers. The thread through them is the inquiry and interaction and directness and things that rely on small populations or groups, and some of that we don't have access to. So how do we take that and translate it to Jeremy or Lauren, who can't necessarily have smaller classes starting tomorrow, right? But they do have these issues still in front of them. And how are we serving our students? And that's another thing from Postman that's interesting to me. I mean, thinking of discussion is part of this too, because we're asking our students to do things we don't do. I mean, let's face it, how many of us are really going and participating in asynchronous discussions that are totally optional to something we're doing? And how many of us are only engaging in that right before some kind of meeting or something where it's going to be apparent, or, you know what I mean? Or it's around, we don't do those. Why do we expect students to, right? But all of this, we're not preparing students for a world that has changed so quickly, including for ourselves. And we're just doing a disservice by not having them think about their own attention and their own approaches and their own information management and organization. And it's a sickness. To me, it's like an illness running through that we are trying to figure out, how to deal with. So when it comes to things like discussion, I think, or it comes to the single classroom, in addition to trying to advocate for a better situation, we still come down to the brass tacks of, well, what do I do? And how can Postman help me think about what I do to make better decisions or richer decisions for my class? That's the question I'm asking you too, Todd. Like, what, besides making the classes smaller and changing the organization, what does Postman help Jeremy think about?
I mean, one that comes to mind that can be done is we refer to it kind of as student agency these days, I think. So you're giving students more agency to direct their path, right? Like that could be different choices from assignments, right? That could be choosing which topic to study. It could be choosing which group to be in. It could be choosing which day to give their presentation to class, or some different vehicles to get to choose from to give their presentation to class. But I do think that is something that all of the people we've looked at thus far have said students need to be empowered to make choices that affect their path in the classroom. And that is something that, whatever you call it, individualized instruction or student agency or whatever it's going to be, just allowing people to have more say. One example that is sort of along those lines is the notion of an annotated syllabus, where you actually act on that in some fashion. I mean, you don't have to agree with what every student says about, like, I don't want a final exam worth 100 points. I want it worth fewer points, but more smaller points, or smaller quizzes in between. But you can allow them to share ideas, express their thoughts about the path of the course, and actually acknowledge those, and very likely, or possibly anyway, make changes based on their input into the direction the course goes. That's doable in any class.
One of the things Postman talks a lot about with education specifically is that through technology around entertainment and information, we have often minimized or lost the idea of the narrative of what a learning community is about, whether it's in a single class or across classes, what a group is doing together, like the why of it, and bringing that back. And I think co-constructing of curriculum and having student input can really help with that. And having students then think critically, naturally, about the technologies and the reasons for that, For instance, having a conversation with your students in a synchronous session about why is it asynchronous discussion doesn't work or isn't working, or what is it we're trying to do, or putting them in situations, the annotated syllabus. I think social annotation is a great way to move forward with that. Media creation, having students actually leading discussions themselves or putting as panels, debates. Like there's so many different structures of what we think of as even traditional discussion, much less alternative technologies to approach it, that I think can really make that richer. And it's fascinating to me to see I've had this many times actually, because I'm just not really much of a believer in asynchronous discussion, but it's fascinating to me to see a group that just you pulling teeth trying to get them to work together in a discussion, but they're annotating a book chapter and they're all over it. And they don't think of that as discussion, but it really is in the end, and how you bring that synthesis. And then also ties to a hobby horse of mine, which is how students have their own individual soft skills and engagements with information and technology. Do they know how to take notes? Do they know how to make synthetic notes so it matters? Do they know how to share what they've learned? Do they know how to do summarizing and synopses instead of, transliterations or copying? There are all kinds of skills that they could really use, and paying attention to their attention. How do we manage our time and attention, which is just something that very few people are really, at least in my experience in classrooms, are talking about directly. How do I cultivate my attention amidst the technological, and it can range from digital detoxes to all kinds of strategies, right? There are all kinds of things out there, but just having students thinking about that, I think, can be really useful from the Postman world of the medium. He had I love the phrase, the medium is the metaphor, which is taking kind of McLuhan's medium as the message and shifting the focus from the medium to being the problem to the metaphors and the way technology is literally shaping our thinking of what we think is important and new and what we do with that. And not because we're perfection leading the charge, right? We're all in this together. I think about it all the time. Like, why do I feel this need to doom scroll the news all the time? All this news I can't possibly use. It's positive is the news I can use, right? Why does my attention span seem like it's declining? And why does research support the fact that attention spans have declined? What is the medium of reading online, reading on the screen, reading on paper? Like, what do these different mediums do that we're not really thinking about because of the convenience? Right. Hey, you can get that digital textbook. It's, $100 cheaper. But there are some real downsides to a digital textbook as well that we aren't necessarily taking into account. Those are the kind of the things that Postman makes me think about. And also, he had a great statement where he said, public schools don't serve the public, they create a public. And he didn't think that was the right way to go. I don't think it's the right way to go, but that kind of is what happens, right? We are not necessarily serving the needs, we're creating needs we think they will have.
I have two more pieces of or advice. One is just actually something that happened yesterday when I was talking to one of our vice chancellors here, and this was a pretty brutal comment, but I was telling them about how I envisioned building out our space. And one of the things I mentioned was, what's our budget for buying books, for example, for faculty to borrow? I mean, like these ones, right? I mean, literally, these are things, right? And she literally said, nobody reads books anymore. And I was just like, oh. I mean, as a high school English teacher, it just killed me. But and I fought back a little. I'm like, yes, they do. People do read books, Hi, Michelle. But I want to make one comment, because Postman definitely believed that we were moving from a text-based society to an image-based society. So that's part of his thing. And Chris can attest to this, or perhaps you folks can too. There's a tool out there called Padlet, right? Which has a variety of ways of expressing stuff. It could be a timeline, it could be a map, but most people use it just for share some thoughts about something. And you can literally just put words in there and you can reply just in words. But most people end up, it seems like, with something that has a lot more images in it. And here's some color makes a difference. it makes a difference how you experience something, right? It's like an accent wall or the brick wall behind Lauren. I mean, it has a feeling just like the words do, and that it could just be that Padlet, because it's maybe novel or something new, that could be it. But it feels different than a discussion forum in Canvas. That combined with the images, I definitely think fits that model of like, it kind of helps us share these days, because we're more likely to share a picture than maybe a paragraph of text.
Todd, I'm sorry, could you say again which program or venue you were just talking about?
Padlet. It's a tool called Padlet. Yeah. Most often used in the K-12 spaces, but there's a lot of faculty here using it. Yeah.
So I actually just saw somebody use Padlet today, and I thought it was very interesting. I thought it was interesting and reminded me I wanted to explore that. But I also am like, well, that just sounds like using technology to battle for amusement and attention, right? I mean, maybe that's where we have to start, because the other thing, like, you guys are stressing me out, like, because it's really big, right? Like you mentioned this idea of public school creating the public, and I think at this point, and by the time students get to our college, right, they've been pretty well formed by the forces that Postman is talking about here. Little attention, doom scrolling, not read. Yeah, actually, that's what really got me, Todd, was because, yes, some people do read anymore. Literally just earlier today, I don't remember what it was, I was thinking about somebody and I said, nobody reads anymore, because it's right in the middle. This is what we're getting. And so it's this is just to say, like, this seems like a really big problem, very difficult for one to work on, especially at a very large institution. And I come away with a sense of like, yeah, so you can use tools like Padlet to like fight the good fight, using technology to get that attention in a more productive way. What's my point? You're just stressing me out. That's it.
Well, I think I mean, I totally hear that. And I do want to say that to me, it's inspiring to think about this, because I think you're right. It's a huge problem. There are many things, but in the end, we still have our limited domain that we really have control to work with most thoroughly. And I think that should be, it's not a bait and switch to use Padlet to engage and reach the same outcomes as you might with a discussion, because the point is, again, that medium is not what we're focused on, and we're not only using it to try to get their attention in a non-specific way, right? So we are cultivating attention that way. So I think the idea that it's stressful that there's such a wide range of tools that are out there.
Right.
It's stressful that there are so many opportunities, but I feel like that, that's kind of that paradox of choice thing, right? That's a stress, but I think it's a stress that we can manage better than not having opportunity. Sure. I have a friend Gardner who has used the metaphor of the bags of gold, where he says, we're out there, we're teaching, we have all of these things, all of these technologies, and we treat them like these bags of gold. And what we do is we're like, it's so heavy, and how are we going to translate that to different currency? And what takes gold anyway, instead of picking up the bags of gold? And I think about that a lot with this, because yes, it's stressful that there are so many things out there, so many possibilities, so many problems, but in the end, we have a lot of opportunity. And it can be very simple, choosing a different medium like Padlet to get at something that gets them where we want to go. And it's just having that bigger picture in mind, but also remembering books are a technology. The technologies, these are all technologies. We've just become more accustomed to working with many of them. And we're now in at the ground floor. We weren't there when Gutenberg was inventing the press so that we could have, books in the mainstream, but we are here when the web and social media and whatever we want to call this apparatus is creating a new kind of attention economy and a new platforms. We're right here. It's awesome in that way. So yeah, discussion forums often don't work in their traditional forum. Fine, we can find something else, but what's the point? What are we trying to do with those interactions? And I would put to you, honestly, that many instructors don't know what the actual learning outcomes are of having the discussions in their classes either. It's just something that we think is naturally intrinsically good.
I'm going to jump in here,
Yes.
perhaps naively, since I'm entering the conversation, late and blindly, but I teach mostly at the master's level in a professional program. And so one of the things that I am acutely aware of is that is just kind of generational differences, because we have a lot of non-traditional students also. So I can have 22-year-olds who are tech natives and know and do things on the computer that I can't begin to contemplate. and then I can have a 60-year-old alongside them in the same classroom where we're trying to have conversations around, what is knowledge and the, epistemology, and how do we know what we know? How do we express? What's the veracity of that? Generalizability versus not? Does it make a difference? All these things. And to try to figure out how to engage everyone, and the extent to which just trying out some of the new tech is the learning hurdle for a chunk of my students, and frankly, sometimes myself, right? Mm-hmm. Not the content and the learning objective, but the where do you get it? How do you turn it on? How do you make the microphone work, right?
Yeah.
It's a brave new world just on that level for me.
Yeah. No, that's very real. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think that as learning management systems like Canvas have evolved and we've evolved with them, that we often defer to that because it is something that more people will have an experience with, and it is something that doesn't surprise us. And that can be a good thing in some situations. If you have such a wide variety, having some commonality that you can get them to with as few hurdles as possible is great. Because often my suggestions will be to go outside of like the UW provided tool set because of looking for certain features and needs, meeting certain needs, but that does come at that technological cost of the not having the same level of support. You have to sign into a different system. You have to have 2 different passwords. You have, and like you, I'm dealing with some folks who are still trying to figure out multiple tabs in their browser, or they're literally closing a window and reopening and it's like, you don't have to do that. So there's different levels. Yeah, it's absolutely challenging. And I don't know how to reach everyone at the same time, but I think providing an opportunity even for them to think about some of these things as they're going is really useful, because I meet with different new master's student groups, and it's always interesting to me when I ask them about their study skills or what do they do, like in terms of studying and organization and note-taking and their attention, and almost none of them at that level yet have really even thought about it or know how to do it.
Jeremy, I think here's one thing I would say. Oh, I want to say
that I was just saying.
I want to say that you won't know, as you probably know, you've impacted so many people in so many amazing ways, and you won't ever hear about it. But you will on occasion. And those are the wins, right? That's huge. Yeah. And so that's no anxiety there.
Thanks, Tom. Take care, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
I was thinking too, as you were talking, like here's what I saw teaching Photoshop in a room to people. So it was at a community college. It was a night class. There was 20 people in the room. They were all at it was a computer lab type environment, but I mean, you're not going to get all of them all the time. That's just the truth of the matter. But it was amazing to see the differences when you talk about age between the younger students and the older students, because I had an incredible mix of people in those classes. Here's the strengths of both. The old people would be the first to buy the book. And I mean old, I'm turning 60, so there you go. The older folks would buy the book. And when I showed them in the software where the help menu was, they were like paying attention to that. Help. That's where you find help, right? The younger students would not buy the book. And they would click around all over the place until something happened that was what they wanted to have happen. And each of those two things has real strengths, right? Like those younger people, while they were clicking around wildly looking for something that was like on page 3 in the book, they discovered all kinds of amazing things that those old people who went right to number 3 or page 3 never saw, right? Same time, those older folks got the answer to what they needed so they could move on to the next thing, and they'd be discovering more and more as they went. But I think those both are real strengths, right? You want to be able to experiment and find things by discovering them on your own, but you also need to have the skills of following a path, I guess, that's been laid out for you.
What
So
kind of
obvious in that
courses
classroom.
do you teach, Michelle? Like what general area?
I'm in social work.
Okay.
So so some of it's clinical skills, but I also teach a bunch just around kind of foundational knowledge and theoretical perspectives and stuff.
Which is really interesting because some of that, like especially the skills of being in a room with somebody and working with somebody, that transactional distance of something like this is not the same. Like that's yeah.
And we are really struggling with that around what do you do with participation? So pre-COVID, we had a mandate that people, butts and seats. And if you weren't there for 70% of the classroom time, we couldn't evaluate if you were going to be problematic out in the field. And it would elevate quickly to potential conversations around your continuance in the program. And so we're struggling with what to do with that now and how to translate it. And of course, a chunk of our students are like, well, what difference does it make? Because everybody does telemedicine.
Well,
and I've got to say, anxiety in general has gone way up, and people are struggling with social anxiety. It's a whole new ball of wax. Yeah. One of the other technology things that I've really struggled with are the number of people that come back, the number of students that are coming back to me with challenges because they're just trying to do academics on a phone. And I don't get it. I can't conceive of it. I'm like, things are set up so that like there's links so that you can do, I'm like, well, where's your computer, right? And they're like, well, this is in between this and that. This is the time I had to do it. I tried to do it on the phone. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you about how to open this other browser while if you have the computer, you could have 2 things up and you would be done in 15 minutes, right? Like,
yep. Yeah, and I mean, some of that comes down to how you're defining what people need or use or don't in your classes, because without an intentional approach to do that, you're going to end up with that range. And that, like, it's cool that people can do so many things. My daughter was like 3/4 of the way through her master's in accounting, and she was basically only using her phone, which blew my mind. Like, you're looking at spreadsheets and whatever on whatever they do in accounting. I don't know. But yeah, but her classes didn't tell her, like, you need to have X, Y, or Z to take this class, which I think is probably a useful thing to have.
Well, and you're UW-Tacoma, as am I, and a number of our students, there's financial challenges.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
So all of a sudden we're entering into the space around what are the equity implications based on who can access to actually buy the book versus what they can pirate or find for free on the web, and they may have spent all the discretionary income on the phone and the phone plan, and there's nothing left for the computer. So
yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it's a huge issue, and we just keep seeing successive waves of the equity question with different technologies, whether it's the platform itself, or there's been a lot of discussions recently that we've been part of as well around AI. And like, even if you embrace the use of AI, which I think in many cases makes sense to help students get oriented with it and how it can be a helpful aid, there are already access issues. Like, can you pay $20 a month to get the newest one? So that, you know what I mean? It's just a challenge. And, my wife is a therapist, so I totally understand some of those, I don't even know. It's like, it's where we bridge the face-to-face and tele and distance in ways that maybe shouldn't be. Like, I know what Neil Postman's answer would be to the question of how do you prepare people using this kind of media for being good sitting in a room? He would say you don't. Like, that's just not the right way to go. It's a misfit. And I mean, and it's logically fair. I personally have seen a lot of therapists, which is either says something about me or about them. I don't know, but I would want them to understand how to sit in a room with me and work. I want a doctor to have worked on something physical before they're operating on me. Like, there's certain, but then we run into issues where we don't always get to make that choice. You know, you probably don't get to say we can only do face-to-face instruction for these courses or this time. You know, there's.
Yeah. Well, we're struggling with that. We haven't given up, but what exactly does that look like? And so for our social work, we have a practicum, which is basically an internship. So there's some spaces for that where it's required and we get feedback, but are we accidentally offloading that heavy lift and assessment to our community partners then instead? It's all very complicated.
Yeah. But I think within the realm, like, without affecting that larger question, I think within this, the other aspects of Postman, or another aspect that I think is just, again, useful, is how are you orienting your students toward their metacognitive skills, and understanding of how they learn and learn to learn, and how to manage themselves as they go out into the real world and practice, as well as within the educational institution. Because again, this is all unfamiliar stuff to everybody, but we just expect people to naturally accustom themselves to it. It's very strange to me. Like, imagine 15 years ago describing the world of 2023 and saying, we're not going to teach you how to deal with any of it. It's just all going to be there. You're going to be in it all the time. Good luck. And that's kind of what we do. And it amazes me. And higher ed is weird about that because we don't prepare our instructors to teach generally, so people don't learn to teach. And then students don't learn to learn because they're not taught metacognitive skills for the most part. And it's all in an environment that is continually tapping into us and our attention and time, but we don't really talk about how to deal with that, how to be a learner. And I know that was part of, I think, why Postman had some of the ideas about narrative community he had, was to battle what he was already seeing, and that was with the television. It wasn't even with the internet and what we're dealing with now. So to me, that's where Postman is valuable, is thinking about what can we give our students in this context. I mean, it doesn't answer that question about face-to-face and telehealth, but it certainly provides opportunities to think about how students can be helping themselves and also then accommodating when they do get out there. What was that, Todd?
So one of the concept of like learning how to learn, sort of, that really observing the kind of the metacognitive whatever stuff is, I think that's definitely, I don't remember which book that's from, but that whole idea of process over product, right? And really talking through what these things are doing to us, or how we're going to use them, or can we use them? How can we help each other learn them? That whole part of, I think a lot of classes ignore that. They make statements about the syllabus, or they make statements about what's going to happen, and then that's what happens, instead of talking about kind of the process to get to those things and why that's important or valuable to them.
And some shy away from having discussions about it because it's seen as maybe making too visible of what is seen as a flaw in the process, right? Like, if I were in Michelle's shoes with therapists who are going to be going out working face to face, but maybe you're mostly or all completely learning, through media like this, I would be saying, okay, this is a flaw in the overall process. Here's what you can do to help yourself as you make the transition out into this environment, right? So how is it that you can take Todd, who hasn't yet sat in a room with a client, what can you do to help him make that learning process as smooth and as safe as possible? right? But that means admitting that there is maybe an issue here, that this isn't like the real world, or this isn't necessarily directly applicable, or we could be doing this differently and we're not. And that's a vulnerability that can be hard to share, or even administratively impossible in some cases, maybe. I don't know.
I think and I don't know if this comes from like my grandparents just in the 50s, because I'm sure it evolved to that place. But I think for me and my experience and my family and my own history, I've watched how shame, or like it was never good to say, I don't know, or I failed, or I'm sick, or I don't have any money. I mean, those are all seen as like these things you just don't talk about, like alcoholism, you just don't talk about that sort of thing. And I just feel like we've been so saturated with that as a culture that, yeah, it's just way easier to stand in front of the class and say, this is it, this is the thing, this is it, we're done, and we're gonna get there. There's no, well, why are we doing this, or what did we learn last time that we could benefit from today, or whatever.
Yeah, so just so you know, Michelle, we didn't assume anybody would necessarily know about Postman. Lauren had read one of his books. Jeremy had not. That's perfectly fine. I do love what you said there in your chat.
Yeah, the AI stuff is a problem for me now. I also want to say this whole idea around kind of subversiveness and how do you get people thinking and owning their learning and stuff, which I think is, we've known for a while is hugely important for adult learners, right? Oh my goodness, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. It'll come back to me.
Well, while that's coming back, I just want to highlight, you said in the chat, I do a lot of work about learning to learn, and critical thinking being the thing that will differentiate clinicians versus technicians. And I think that's awesome, because it so overtly demonstrates, I think, a dynamic that's in almost every classroom, right? Which is the person who, if you're in a computer programming class, is the person who can creatively program and address problems and generate ideas, versus the person who can follow along. And this is where AI fits right in, right? Like AI can be really good at writing programs of certain sorts, but that doesn't make you a programmer. And I think the clinician versus technician is fascinating, because it's like you can know a lot about it, but if you don't have it in action, if you're not embedded in part of a community, if you're not continuing to evolve in your evolution of your thinking, like it doesn't matter as much. And it's certainly not good for the people you're working with. So that's exactly what Neil Postman is about in many ways.
And I remember what I was going to say. It's a brave act also for instructors, because you piss off a number of your students. I am using better pedagogy. I am doing better teaching, and I get much worse teaching evaluations now, because every given session, I am annoying some number of them, right? Like I would do better if I just came in and did, especially at the master's level, I did what they expected. I did the typical class assignments. I had the asks that they were used to from undergrad that they could do in their sleep and blindly, but not push them, that the type A's know how to do and expect. And if I push them out of their comfort zone, even with support so that they can be successful, they don't like it, right?
Absolutely.
Likewise, if I'm trying to flip that classroom enough so that there's other kinds of skills or priorities that are highlighted and valued, folks that have been unseen, that can be uncomfortable, even though it's validating and success too, right? Like it's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So I take solace in the fact that there's no universal themes on my student critiques, because one is saying the teamwork is horrible and detracted. The other one says, oh, it came alive through the teamwork. They like the reading, they the lectures. The other, it's across the board. But but how we as colleagues in an institution are going to assess one another's competency as instructors is hugely linked to this. And we need to pay attention and talk to our colleagues about that, because it's very easy for better work to be penalized in this system.
Yep, that is a great point. And, you know, I think especially numeric evaluations of instruction should go away completely, because research doesn't support that they're really helpful at all. But it is absolutely an issue. I use my daughter as an example of this all the time, because for many years while she was going through her higher education, we would talk about what I do, and basically I did all the things she hated as a student. She's like, I don't want to have discussions. She's like, what is authentic assessment? Oh, I don't want that. I don't like that. Yeah, she's that kind of student. She just wanted to get through and get it done. You know, I take solace in the fact myself that she's a good accountant. Like, she does good work. She's recognized for it. So it worked out for her. But yeah, you can pay a price for that. And I think, you know, innovators generally, and people bucking that trend, tend to pay some hidden costs as well, and time and effort and disappointment and, you know, just all kinds of things. But I don't think you're letting that stop you, and I don't think we can let it stop us. But I do think that on a practical note, like for that, in being engaged with the university as they discuss this, for instance, right now at UW-Tacoma, there are discussions going on about how to evaluate instruction, what peer evaluation looks like, how that counts toward potentially toward tenure and promotion. And so being involved in those discussions so you can try and have some influence on them. I always recommend that all instructors do their own evaluations, in-class evaluations anyway, so that you have something to go along with those numbers. Because usually the kind of narrative evaluations of some kind, or the surveys, end of course, or even mid-course, give you insight. Well, you know, I scored 3 out of 5 on this, but what my students are saying is this, which can be helpful. I don't think relying on those numeric Scantron things alone is not good anyway.
Do you have an example or suggestion for how to get those done? I'm not sure I know what you're talking about.
How to do what?
How to do the augmented, like a template or
I can share, yeah, certainly. I will share via email with you, is probably the quickest way. I'll share via email some examples. Because yeah, it's easy to build such a thing, and they're relatively easier to take one and modify it. And I just recommend it anyway, both mid-course and at the end of the course. Which helps. And there's only so much we can do as individuals inside the system, right? I mean, we just have to keep trying to do what makes the most sense for us. But I do think, again, one of the values of Postman's approach, just as a cultural critic and technological kind of media critic, is just standing back from our assumptions as far back as we can. Sometimes just can be valuable in it itself, that we're making intentional decisions in this area, and that we learn from them and we change and adapt as we go. So I do want to be recognize the time. It's 1:32. I'm happy to, I don't know about Todd's schedule, I'm happy to keep talking, but I just want to make sure to recognize and thank you for your attending, and thank you for coming in, because it's great to meet folks and to have some discussions about this. And Michelle, since you haven't read Postman yet, I definitely recommend check out, I would say The End of Education is a pretty fascinating one. Teaching a Subversive Activity, or as Lauren saw, Amusing Ourselves to Death.
I definitely want to read those other, some of those other books. And thanks for the discussion. Sorry I didn't really participate much, just a lot of thinking and listening that, but I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for your time, Lauren, and we'll be seeing you in the class. And is sometimes just, these are the great thing about, one of the points of having these discussions with Todd was just, these are big thinkers with big ideas. And it's hard in 1 hour to figure out how to narrow it down, like, you know, but it's just to trigger our thinking, to think about, you know, go back and realize people have been thinking about these things for a long time, and they have some good ideas that maybe we can make more out of. And with Postman, for instance, you know, his work ends in 2003. A lot has changed, but that just means we have new opportunities to think about some of these great ideas and what to do with them. Todd says, our last suggestion is the most difficult. It requires honest self-examination. Ask yourself how you came to know whatever things you feel are worth knowing. Yeah. I would have to dispense with a lot of my formal education. I mean, honestly, I feel like or at least the education, the in classroom, the class part of it, the connections you make, the people you meet, the experience. But then some really stand out. Yeah, it's a great way to kind of reframe
I
things.
want to bridge the evaluations and that process and what you just said somehow. My dad was a dentist. He went to USC, UCLA, knew his stuff, right? If you asked anybody in his office, or if I ever went into his office when I was a kid and a patient was standing there, they never said, oh, he really knows how to drill in my teeth. They always said, your dad has the best chairside manners ever. And it's that part, I mean, he loves to talk to people. And it was that part of the work. It wasn't the math, it wasn't the science, it wasn't the content. It was the things that were happening all around that, you know? I mean, not that you would ignore the other, but that was clearly really important to all those people. And yeah, anyway.